Awesome. Well, we are very lucky to have Rasheed Griffith with us here today. Rasheed is the CEO of the Caribbean Progress Studies Institute and the Emergent Ventures Africa Caribbean Lead at Mercatus. And he also writes frequently on the Caribbean Progress Studies Institute Substack, so I encourage you all to check it out. For the first 45 minutes or so, I'll be asking questions, and then we can open it up for those who are here. And yeah, so to get started, Rasheed, could you please share your background with us and the journey that led you to establish the Progress Studies Institute?
Yeah, it's not particularly common. I guess maybe if you're living in startup land, it's pretty common. I dropped out of college and I to join a startup in Barbados, where I'm from, and that was a fintech startup. And that went well. And then after that company got acquired, I went to another startup in the Philippines. So I moved from Barbados to the Philippines, taking a massive culture shock, one of the biggest you can actually do. That was my first time living outside the country. And then I was there for a few years. And then I moved to the Panama City to start this time, me and some colleagues, we started our own company. And while in Panama, I met Tyler, and Tyler essentially brought me in to the policy world, economic growth theory, writing online, those kind of things. And that is how I had a lot more exposure to people in Washington, D.C. And then from those kind of interactions, I was invited then to give more presentations, and that led to one thing to another, where I'm now full time essentially in progress studies type activities and talking. So kind of from fintech, startup land in Southeast Asia and Caribbean to Washington, D.C., European progress studies conversations. Quite a big difference.
Yeah, and what was the event that you met Tyler at? How did that happen?
So funny enough, I actually applied to Emergent Ventures to get a grant from Tyler for a project. The project at the time was a podcast on Chinese Caribbean foreign policy and economics. So while I lived in Asia, in the Philippines, I did a lot of activity in China, and I learned Chinese and to try to understand more business in China and so on. And then when I went back to the Caribbean, I realized there's a whole ecosystem of activity happening, and no one's really discussing it in a concrete or nuanced way. You have a lot of people in America or Europe having very superficial conversations about the foreign policy between two regions. And I say, you know what? I don't have any actual academic ring and make some comics, and that is what happened with the so that's how Tyler and me first interacted. And then
Wow,
he came on my podcast, and then that went to a whole new thing in itself.
wow, that's a very cool journey. And how would you characterize the difference between the U.S. relationship, Chinese relationship with the group?
So China activity is via corporate sector. And with the American situation, the relationship is a lot deeper. So I don't want to make it seem like America is the superficial partner in the game here. It's substantially deeper culturally, sociologically, politically, those kind of things. But when you ask Caribbean people about America, they always have some weird superficial comment where I think people in the Caribbean tend to not think of America as a place apart. It's just something that we have always lived with. It's a very close part of the Caribbean. Every person in the Caribbean has at least one close family member, some aunt or uncle or cousin lives in New York, for example, or Miami. That's just part of how we live. Where in China, China is a very new player in the region. So a lot of misgivings, a lot of mischaracterizations, misconceptions exist. But the reason why people kind of focus on Chinese interaction, not let's say American interaction, is because it's so new. So in the newness comes a lot of misunderstanding. And very often it is a misunderstanding stoked by American paranoia our American foreign policy paranoia, our American military paranoia. And that is where things get a bit out of hand because people then in the Caribbean lose out based on, American anxiety. So one of the favorite things, for example, I remember years ago, not that long ago, maybe 3 years ago, the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda had made a comment saying, we have to cancel the Huawei deal because it's angry, Americans getting angry. Although, he said, although it is the best deal on the market. We have this kind of comments. It's very clear what's happening. So it's a lot of dimensions happening, finance, banking. For example, little known fact outside of if you're very into corporate finance, a lot of the international Chinese companies that are, let's say, even in American stock market, it's actually Caribbean companies. So the Cayman companies that are actually we call a variable interest entity where it's a Cayman Islands company listed on the US stock exchange that's actually acting on behalf of a Chinese firm. So when you see these Chinese companies in the US, they're not actually Chinese companies, they're Caribbean companies in BVA or the Cayman Islands. So lots of dimensions there of the Caribbean. You don't really discuss this in a very, very, very niche circle of law or finance, for example.
Wow, that's very interesting. So some of the focus areas of the Caribbean Progress Studies Institute include economic growth acceleration, dollarization, fiscal conservatism, industrial policy for small economies, limited government, and Caribbean citizenship by investment programs. So I would like to go through some of these. So one of them is that you think many countries in the Caribbean, from my understanding, should dollarize. Could you explain your reasoning there and why you think this is a good idea?
Yeah, all Caribbean countries should dollarize, not some. And it is, it's one of those things where I always ask this question, do you think Kansas City should have its own currency? Right? I think in most cases, a reasonable person would say, no, it should not have its own currency. And Kansas City has a higher GDP per capita than any Caribbean country. So, however, you think that a Caribbean country should have its own currency. Or, for example, is it better off or worse off? This is a bit more technical, that France is in the Eurozone and Germany is in the Eurozone, not have a separate currency. Again, slightly more complicated, but in most cases, they would say the euro is a good idea. The Caribbean has roughly 11 different currencies where the population is a fraction of New York, or the population fraction is actually less than London City, for example. But somehow we still think it's reasonable for all of these small islands to have its own currency. And it only causes obstruction. The only benefit to have a small country like Barbados, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, to have its own currency is the government has a bit more leeway to mismanage fiscal priorities. So monetary finance, or what you call printing money in more casual conversation. And oftentimes, for example, in Barbados, the currency is fairly stable at the expense of more liberty, where, for example, you have extremely tough capital controls in Barbados. So it's pegged 2 to 1. So $1 is $2 for maybe at least 40 years now. But each person in Barbados, generally speaking, has a limit of 20,000 USD per year of exchange they can use to buy things outside the country. And that is pretty hard to trade off. You don't need to do that if you just use USD. And oftentimes people frame it as, okay, you're going from 0% USD to 100% USD in a country. That are already pricing USD. Imports are pricing USD. All exports are pricing USD. Okay, so you're actually going from maybe 80% USD to 100%. Where the bigger trade, the bigger commercial activity is already done in USD. So it's more of just saying, hey, accept the world as it is. Let's not pretend we live in a different world and dollarize. So Panama, for example, substantially larger economy than anything or Caribbean proper, has been dollarized for over 100 years. Ecuador dollarized, El Salvador is dollarized, and again, all substantially bigger economies. Argentina might eventually dollarize, actually, probably quite soon, based on the President Milei's essentially policy proposal that he ran on, and he really does believe it, and that will probably come very soon. So it, and also BVI in the Caribbean is already dollarized since 1959, I believe. So there are already examples of this working as normal, but a lot of the resistance to dollarization comes from the government, not from people. So oftentimes when you ask someone plain, hey, should your country dollarize? Oftentimes, honestly, they'll say no. But when you ask them latent questions, okay, what currency do you tend to save your money in? What currency do you try to get when you want to go to out the country? Always USD. And then when you ask them is that, they realize, oh, wait, why do we have our own currency? That's pretty silly. So you realize the explicit questions are also a bit too wishy-washy to some people. You ask them latent questions, but they're actualized. You raise a precedent qualification, a very big deal for this kind of topic also. So dollarization to me is a very boring policy. I say it's called a boring radical policy because it sounds outrageous, but in reality, we already use dollar for everything else. Let's just go tiny bit percent more and use it for everything else. And by doing that, you will have a lot more fiscal credibility in small Caribbean countries, which is actually the biggest problem as it is when it comes to international market access.
Thank you. And you mentioned Panama as being one of the countries that dollarized. And before we started, you mentioned to me that Panama is one of the few S tier cities, according to
Yeah.
yourself. So
Yes.
what explains like Panama's economic prosperity and just like general social prosperity?
Mm. I wrote a blog post that, let's say, part one of a blog post that I want to explain this topic because this comes up a lot. Firstly, people don't think about Panama that much, but when they do, they get curiouser and curiouser. So Panama is a very curious example of private market activity parallel to very high state corruption. And the state corruption, because of the independent market activity, has not leaked into the market and caused substantial slowdown, which is a very particular case. So, for example, Latin America in general has a very weird set of examples when it comes to right-wing dictatorships having a free market orientation. So the most common example of this is Chile, where in the dictator Pinochet, when he was in charge of Chile by a coup, he actually installed a lot of University of Chicago school economists to run the financial system, to run the economy, and those were often called now Chicago boys. So you have a lot of terms, but Chicago boys is usually misattributed to people literally at Chicago, like Friedman and so on, but it actually means for the Chilean economists that ran the government of Chile under Pinochet, who were all PhDs from University of Chicago. So, and Chile is a substantial good example of, good reforms happening very quickly. So in Panama, similar thing happened. Another Chicago boy, not from Chile, a Panamanian, also a PhD from Chicago, at the same time, a bit after the Chilean Chicago boys, he became the senior economic advisor to Omar Torrijos, who was again a military dictator that took over the government of Panama in 1969 by a coup. And this Chicago boy, his name is Barletta, eventually also became president of Panama as well. But along the way, he instituted a lot of private sector market-led reforms during the dictatorship, actually, that led the country to have this kind of split in who actually can control trade and economics and operation. So one of the big things was that in 1970 in particular, there was a new law led by Barletta under Torrijos government to reform the banking sector to have it a lot more market driven and so on, to kind of use the dollars that they have at that time. Also, he was also the person of the chief negotiator to get the Panama Canal from the US to Panama. So that also happened under Torrijos, the military dictator, with again the chief person in charge of the trade deal and the economic policy as the Chicago economist as well. And the Panama Canal right now is ran by an independent semi-government authority. So it's not a political activity in Panama. It's very technocratic. There is some politics, but it's very technocratic and it's very kind of, let's say, market-driven. So because his massive impact on the way Panama policy has been set via, again, the military dictatorship, even after military dictatorship was over, via actually a very good intervention by the US after it kind of gotten bad. What happened? Torrijos died in a helicopter crash, and the person that came after him as the military head was substantially worse. So the US came in, took out Noriega, reinstalled democracy. One of the few examples of the US intervention working very, very, very well. Anyway, all of those things that Barletta put on stuck. So you have a system where the government is very corrupt, but the money-making activities of the economy, the Panama Canal, the logistics, the banks, are ran by independent autonomous organizations that were set up via the Chicago Boy incentive structure. So the very history of that. But yeah, the Caribbean economists don't have Chicago Boys to run the country, unfortunately. So.
That's very interesting. So then on one hand, we have like these very open economic policies. But one of the other focus areas of the Caribbean, the CPSI, is also industrial policy for these countries. So how do you like envision marrying these two? And like what are some policies that you think would be good for countries in the Caribbean to implement?
There are a lot of things. I'll focus on one that's a bit almost ironic, and I call it industrial policy. It's tourism, which is never cast as industrial policy. So a lot of Caribbean countries, not all, but many, run on tourism. And it's not surprising to anybody, I believe. However, tourism is often to me mischaracterized as merely a service industry. Of course, it is a service industry, but in the sense of tourism is a natural resource where, the sun is there, the sand is good, the beach is nice. And the reason you have those is because of your superior geography. The old term that some British economists actually use to apply to Singapore when it comes to trade route. Stafford, for example, said Singapore has a superior geography because of its location on the trade routes in the Pacific and so on. But the same concept is why tourism is very good in the Caribbean. Your land happens to be here. You didn't choose that. That's a natural thing of geography. So when you think of geography this way, or we think of tourism as a geographical base, a geological base, it's a natural thing. So you think about how do you industrialize natural resources? Well, if you think of tourism in this like more ambitious term, natural resource, not just some side project of services, you realize that the constraint often in the Caribbean is on the supply side, not demand side. So usually in the Caribbean, you hear, okay, tourism is a mature market, that therefore the inclusive numbers have tapered off to a particular set and hasn't gone past that thing. Then therefore people say, okay, we should expand to China or India or whatever. And my thing is no, because when you look at the numbers, the number of hotel rooms in Barbados, for example, has not actually increased since 1980. In many instances, the quality has increased. That's good, but the number has not substantially increased since then. But you complain saying, "Oh, we don't have the more tourist arrivals." Where are they going to go if they arrive? So, on the constraint is supply, And the reason why the supply is constrained is one, the government is very ineffective in thinking of tourism as an industrial policy. So having good tax structure for international chains, having good structure for your brand, for example, the tourism marketing agency is not very technocratic. It's very, very, very political. And also along in the established hotel lobby, to campaign to get preferential treatment, whereas it doesn't allow new entrants in the market. So those things kind of, if you think about it in that industrial way, prevent the industrialization process of going on further, even when it comes to tourism. So essentially we have is a situation where your government needs to step back a bit, allow more market entry, be less bureaucratic. For example, there's some international chains that have been trying to get into Barbados for over a decade, some big ones that you would think should be there already, mind you. And they have all these blocking from government agencies that are very slow to do things, for example, and also the hotel lobby pushing against it as well. Or you have very odd laws being passed to benefit the existing hotels without the benefit of the potentially new entrants. So it goes on the line on that side. Simply rethinking the way how you think about tourism as a natural resource, as the industrialization process is very important. For example, in Barbados, there's not even a single place to have a big international business conference. Again, you would think that's a no-brainer, but these things aren't brought into the conversation, and yet you hear it's a mature market, we need to diversify away from it. I'm like, no, that's not actually what you have to do at all. So making those arguments a bit more public is one of the big things we're doing, especially very, very, very small Caribbean countries. That let's be honest, there are very few things small Caribbean countries can do that will ever match or outcompete tourism because you have a natural advantage.
Yeah, that's a good point. So is the migration of talented like individuals or just high human capital generally from Caribbean nations to countries like the US or places in Europe or Canada like a challenge for development in these countries? And like if so, what strategies can the Caribbean like implement to like try to retain or at least benefit in some ways from the brain drain?
So I am part of the problem in this question very, very clearly as I sit here in Madrid talking to you about the Caribbean policy. But the reality is, very oftentimes, there are lots of people who grew up in the Caribbean, have their secondary high school education in the Caribbean. They go overseas, they go work at Facebook, go work at Goldman Sachs, they'll go work at Bain and Co. And say, you know what, I want to go back and do something government, but they can't get hired because of very odd governmental hiring practices. So one of the things that I want to propose is to internationalize the public sector. And this, again, isn't radical in the sense that it used to be done. So when Barbados was still a colony of the UK, they had the whole empire still going, it was very common to have Canadians in Barbados, to have people from England in Barbados, but it was seen as one big space. When the independence came in different Caribbean countries, this went away, and you thought you had to run everything internally. Now, from a basic top of funnel perspective, it's very difficult to run a country well if you're starting from a funnel of 100,000 people. That seems like it won't work, and clearly it has not worked. Now, if you allow people who are Canadian, for example, who might just want to live in Barbados or live in St. Lucia or raise their kids in a tropical Caribbean country to come and work in the public sector, that should be allowed. So other Caribbean countries have done some of this in very minor ways, and others to a bigger extent. So, for example, in the Cayman Islands or BVI, which is still they're still overseas territories of the UK. They're not fully independent. They actually have a lot more internationalization of their public sector than the independent Caribbean countries, even though the independent Caribbean countries could easily do it by one law, being passed or one omnibus law being passed, for example. So it is a system where, yes, you're going to have brain drain. You're a small Caribbean country, you're a small Pacific country, you're a small African country. That's going to happen, but I don't think as a negative problem. It's only a problem because you can't actually allow people back in very easily. And oftentimes people want to just come to a different country to live and work in a new government. People are not only motivated by money, it's also prestige, for example, it's all these other things. And if you allow that, I'm sure a bunch of Americans actually will want to come to Barbados next week just to work in the Ministry of Finance, for example, and say, let's build this.
Yeah.
So I don't think of brain drain as a problem. I think of it as just a fact of life. The reality is you can reduce the stress of brain drain by allowing internationalization. And if you do that, then your market is the world market.
Mm, interesting. And so one of the other aspects of the focus areas of the Caribbean Progress Studies Institute is the Caribbean Citizenship by Investment programs.
Mm.
So what are these and why are you excited about them?
So it's not a matter of me being excited about them per se. It's a matter of these being very important and people don't discuss it in a very nuanced way. So there are 5 Caribbean countries that sell passports. I use the word sell passports. The technical term is selling citizenship by investment. So either St. Lucia, St. Kitts, Dominica, Grenada, and Antigua sell citizenship. So there are different options to do it. The price has, for a long time, the minimum price is about 100,000 US dollars. The price has gone up a bit in the last couple of years because of some pressure from the European Union and from the US and so on. So I think the minimum price is now 250,000 US dollars. And for some Caribbean countries like St. Kitts or Dominica, this economic activity accounts for a substantial proportion of the total revenue. So, for example, in terms of St. Kitts, it's about almost 20% of revenue is from selling passports. That's a substantial amount. Or, for example, in Dominica, the is to match this thing, but more than 50% of non-tax revenue is from selling passports. And also, these are a lot of passports per year. The data is not always very clear on how many sales are done per year, but you can back estimate from the numbers in the budget that you get per year. But there are more there are likely, not likely, there are more Dominican citizens in the world via passport sale than via natural birth. So again, they're big numbers, right? Yeah, it's like not a big country, to be clear, but still, when you put it that way, you get something you scale a bit. Now, a substantial proportion of buyers are Chinese people, Chinese nationals. And you can see why there's some tension points when that is said in the US. And the US have had substantial issues with this. For example, in Southcom, the military office, in the State Department, and even in the EU, in the UK as well. They've all have substantial issues with this practice, but it's a big portion. So again, another quote from a Caribbean prime minister is when, in reference to how the US is keep trying to denigrate the passport sale market, he says they're trying to kill us. They literally said kill. He said kill us. So it's a pressure point. So if you don't understand how important these markets are to these Caribbean countries, you're not going to get to a point where you can understand how to deal with it or what the problem is, if it is a problem. In many ways, it's not a problem, in my view, but it's a nuanced conversation. So the reason why we do that is because there are not many people putting in effort to discuss this kind of economic activity. You always think of Caribbean tourism or other things, but you don't think about it as an investment platform for passports. And for some countries, it is. So this is one example of we have we meaning CPSI, we have a focus on Chinese foreign policy in the Caribbean, and this is a wedge issue into that policy conversation as well because it has all of the different tangling points going on. So yeah, that's why that is a focus point of ours.
Mm. Now, shifting gears a bit, the West Indies Federation was an attempt to create like a political union among several Caribbean colonies. in the mid 20th century, with the aim of like trying to eventually like achieving independence as a single entity. But why did this unification effort like not come to fruition? And like, what do you make of the prospects of reunification or not reunification, unifying Caribbean countries today? As we've discussed, they're obviously quite small, and so maybe it seems intuitive that coming together would be beneficial for many different aspects of governance.
So the British West Indies Federation did exist for 4 years,
Mm,
1958 until 1962. And it took a long time to form. So it didn't come out of the blue and say, hey, tomorrow we're going to do this thing, let's do it. No, it took over a decade of planning. A lot of it was pushed by the UK Parliament at the time. Again, this was still when the Caribbean was all colonies, except Haiti, Cuba, all colonies. So the British colonies, 8 of them, decided to do the federation. And the UK was thought was a very good idea because when you read the contemporaneous documents at the time, they're like, it seems very unlikely these small countries can exist properly as independent states. What you should do is come together like Canada, like Australia. These people forget Canada was separate colonies as well before they kind of moved to one system. Same with Australia. So the Federation Constitution was actually based on the Australian Constitution because that was the same idea, essentially speaking. Now, the problem comes in. I'm working on like a series of blogs on this topic now also because it's one of those things where it's not well discussed what happened. A lot of documentation. The Caribbean history in the 20th century is so poorly understood. It's ludicrous, honestly speaking. And none of the documents are online. You have to go to archives in the UK, and it's a whole thing. Anyway, so it happened, and the rationale that the people at the time had are still correct. It's still sound. Too small population, not enough variability in things you can do in a small independent country. You should come together as one federal unit because that's where you have a fighting chance of having a collective civil service, again, to overcome a top of funnel issue, to have more say in national markets. All those things are still true today. It failed in 1962 because at the time, internal insularity pressure happened, and Jamaica, which at the time the biggest economy in the federation, had a domestic issues where the opposition party pushed to have a referendum, and the government had a referendum on federation, and it like Brexit, very slight majority said leave the federation, and it pulled out. When Jamaica pulled out, Trinidad at the time, also a very substantial part of the federation, decided that, you know what, if Jamaica is out, I'm gone too. Because I don't want to be on the hook for all the issues happening in this federation. Jamaica and Trinidad pulled out. And when Trinidad pulled out, essentially it broke apart. And that is what happened. So again, the constitution was a bit shaky. The federal government the cabinet wasn't super properly discussed and properly sorted out. But these are things that have been overcome. There are many times in history where we thought Australia would break apart, or Canada. I mean, we still think that, to be honest. But it hasn't happened because they're a good, solid foundation that can be overcome via politics. And the three important people at the time, Michael Manley from Jamaica, Eric Williams from Trinidad, and Granny Adams from Barbados, they couldn't pull together and figure out a proper solution path. It truly is one of the biggest political scandals of the Caribbean. I think probably the biggest, post emancipation for sure. Definitely last century. And it was political insularity that made it broke apart. And right now, it is still political insularity that keeps any proper unification from happening again. And I don't think you're going to ever get out of the middle income trap in the Caribbean until you have a much better regionalism closer towards federation. Um, and that isn't really even a big topic anymore.
Mm. So you obviously, as you mentioned at the start, you've had a very unique path to get to where you
Mm.
are right now, and you've probably a very different perspective than many people working in the same space. So
Mhm.
what do you think academics in the space of global development generally, particularly in the Caribbean, could be like doing better to study these issues and like ideally making progress on them?
Firstly, people who work in global development definitely underrate economic growth in general. That's just, I think, point number one. Very oftentimes, people have all these potential solutions that never involve more money faster. Essentially, right? Yeah. GDP per capita has to go up. That should be part number one. They don't focus on things that try to push up GDP per capita, and that is a big issue. In terms of Caribbean, and particularly Caribbean has a political problem in the sense that there are no more political questions in the Caribbean. That's the big issue. So people always complain in America about too much politics in America. And I'm like, good, good. You know what the alternative is? Europe. That's the alternative. Okay. It's a nice place to live. I love Madrid. Madrid is actually a lot more dynamic than most part of Spain. But in generally, Europe is a museum. Right? I think you're going to have a trade-off. You have the dynamism of the US economy, but it comes with active politics, almost like suffocating sometimes. But I think that's a good thing. In the Caribbean, you don't have politics. You have people run for elections, and they all have the exact same politics. No one discusses how to reform the public sector. No one talks about what's the different way to do tax policy. Like all of these things are considered to be done, and the only thing to do is rearrange the pie in the next election cycle. And mostly that's what happens. And when you talk to people who work in quote unquote development, they have the same perspective. They don't think about, you know what, maybe we need more politics. We need more polarization, actually speaking, in the Caribbean. Or actually, I mean, most places should need more polarization, should not usually, I think people say very oftentimes. And without that, you're not going to have a situation where you're going to have more debates about what to move forward and what the future should look like. The future, people always say, it's all the thing, history has ended. In my view, the bigger issue is the future has ended, which is why a lot of the way how people in progress studies frame things like, no, we can change the future today if we actually do particular things. In the Caribbean or in many small places, this is much more the case than in the US, which I think is, of course, where most of the progress conversation is done. And I think it's completely misplaced when it comes to the majority of the world is not the US, it's more the Caribbean. And my biggest, it's not like a gripe, it's not a gripe. Like, I think the progress studies movement in the US is important, but often is not really useful for outside the US. And that's, I guess, the biggest objection I have to how it's not discussed. Even when you go to the conferences, for example, it's always, again, this is fine for the US. The problem is thinking about this as a global answer, and it's not. Paul Romer, the economist, had a decent split. He said, you have development and you have growth. They're not the same thing. And in progress, also, you have US centric progress studies, and you should have a non US centric progress studies. Call it, Caribbean progress studies. Also, my things, I use that term, but it's a very different kind of activities that needs to be done. And of course, you are beginning from very different premises. So very oftentimes you don't get this nuanced separation of interests, even in progress studies when it comes to small places or poorer places. And then in generally speaking, when it comes to people, again, the lack of focus on economic growth and the lack of focus on how small economies are honestly different.
So I'm going to try to get in one more question before we open up to some of the couple people in the Zoom. And we've been discussing a lot about the Caribbean, but I have to ask, given how much it's, I guess, being discussed, even in the US, about Argentina. So it seems like
Okay.
as an outsider, like Argentina has had so many fiscal issues in comparison to other countries, maybe at similar levels of like GDP or like similar levels of human talent. So like, do you think there is like what explains this, and what do you make of like the prospects for something like dollarization? Are Milei's reforms working in Argentina?
Oh, I would say first off, I'm a big fan of Milei. Met him, I think, twice so far. I was in Argentina last time was in July, no, June for a few weeks. And Argentina is one of the examples of a country that the fundamental problem is politics. That's not a shock to anybody, I think. But the Kirchner politics of our, people always say about Peronist politics and Peronism, and it's very hard to define those concepts. But essentially, non-market focused policies are generally socialist leaning, have caused substantial damage in Argentina. And they have been in this rut consistently back and forth for actually many, many decades. And you realize that, therefore, what underlies a political problem is a culture problem, where people that live there don't actually realize you can have a better future. They don't realize you can have change. They don't realize that free market is not a bad word, which they actually do think that, because in Argentine case, the Peron actually tries to do a bit more free market stuff, but he's a dictator. So it has that negative tinge to it. It's almost the same in Chile in particular ways as well. And you realize that it's a big cultural problem across Latin America. Argentina is no exception to the rule. It's just part of the rule. People always frame Argentina as an exception. It's not. It's part of Latin America. And Latin American culture is very socialist leaning. Milei, when he won the election, I think a very underreported point was that 70% of people under 25 vote for Milei. It's like substantial, substantial. And you realize, and when you go to Argentina or Buenos Aires in particular and ask young people, they always say, "Yeah, I vote for Milei." They always say, he's crazy, but I feel he's telling us the truth. That's often what you hear them say. And I think that's true. He is a bit crazy, and he also is telling the truth. Well, his inauguration speech, is phenomenal. I think it would go down in the history books. He said, "No hay plata." He said, "There is no money." Inauguration speech, first speech as president. There is no money. Reforms are going to be difficult, but we need to do it, and I will make it happen. First speech. So it's a tough one ahead. I would say maybe the 40% chance of it working. That's you know, I can't say it's, I think 40% is a very optimistic point. And again, I'm a big fan of Millet, big fan. But the political situation is very tough. He has a minority Congress. His party controls no governorships in the entire state. So we'll see what happens. The biggest law that got passed was the omnibus law in June. It was passed midnight vote in the Senate. The vice president had to cast the final vote to decide. It happens that she's his party and she voted in favor of the law, but it literally won by one vote in the Senate. So when you have those kind of margins, there's so much room for failure, honestly speaking, in politics. And we will see what happens in the congressional election next year in Argentina, where you have, hopefully, he will get a bigger proportion of the Congress in his party, or at least people in care of his policies. But it's constant pushback. Even now that his things has increased the surplus, massively reduced the inflation, still getting pushback substantially from population, from trade unions, from the left-wing parties, from the Communist Party in a small proportion. So there's so much against him winning, And there's so much against Argentina being successful that I can't go more than a 40% rate of success at this point, even though I'm a big fan. But when you go to Buenos Aires, you realize that it's a very deep city that has a lot of culture there, but culture is very broken where it comes to political change, and that's just a factor of Latin America in general.
Well, thank you so much. This Q&A has been so fun. And now I'll open it up to just a few people who are with us on the Zoom. And so, yeah, Laura, Keishi, or Berke, if either of you guys have questions, feel free to jump in.
Okay, I have a question. So first, thanks so much for all your insight. It was amazing. So I want to ask, I want to ask about the open market policies in the Caribbean. So given like the connection between anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism, do you think open market policies complicate efforts for independence, and how so?
Oh, there is a substantial link in Caribbean culture recently that is anti-imperial, which oftentimes is linked to capitalism. That's true. And this actually really got going via a particular book that is very popular in the Caribbean and outside the Caribbean called Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. Eric Williams was the first prime minister of Trinidad, and who was also a historian, PhD from Oxford back in the 40s. And he wrote this book saying, well, the reason why Britain ended slavery is not because of goodwill or moral adjustment. It was because of capitalist interest. It became too expensive to have slaves. That was his argument. So because of that, in some ways, you would think that maybe it's actually okay. Well, capital interest is probably a good thing, but anyway, the point is, it's normally focused as a way to say it's actually the capitalists that keep us down in the Caribbean. That's generally what it is, and they kind of fuse that into anti-imperial thought in the Caribbean. Where in reality, I wrote about this on the blog, and I will do more of this in the future. In reality, the bulk of growth happened in the Caribbean was just at the tail end of the colonial period, not after. And it's very, very clear, for example, in Barbados. Because at the time, the administration of the country was better run, honestly speaking, by international people from England, oftentimes, or Canada. When you had independence, it became much more difficult to have talent to run the country. So, therefore, they had less proper talent in the public sector. Very early on in independence, also, some Caribbean countries took a turn leftward, where because of the British management of the economy back in the 60s, 50s, 40s, late 40s, it was more or less, classical liberal. Over time, it became a lot more left-leaning. And there's one of my favorite ever paragraph written, it is actually in the memoir of Lee Kuan Yew, when he discussed his trip to Jamaica and meeting Michael Manley at the time, who we mentioned earlier with the Federation. He said, you know what? It is quite sad what happened to Jamaica. They were doing so well, and then they went so left. That's Lee Kuan Yew making this comment. Because he saw it happen in real time too. And I can remember he had a speech in Singapore as a political rally. He said, I will never let Singapore do what Jamaica did. At the time, Jamaica was a lot better off than Singapore. And he said, look what they did to that country. I will never let that happen here. I will die first. It was a very weird, powerful speech. So there is an issue where anti-imperial thought and anti-open market thought are fused. And I don't know a very good way yet of thinking about that question. My best path towards a solution is try to make people realize that a lot of native Caribbean art is actually very free market oriented. So oftentimes when you look at, for example, dub or reggae music, a lot of the basic themes that we just sing and think are perfectly fine are very individualist focused, very anti-state, for example. A lot of early regulators like that. It's hard to see sometimes because the reggae that people are usually exposed to in America or Europe is kind of like Bob Marley One Love reggae, which is not actual core reggae. Core reggae is more like, for example, Peter Tosh had a song about it's in 1980s saying, if you burn the marijuana, I will burn the cane fields. Those are the kind of themes that you see in reggae a lot more often. So a lot of the artistic talent of the Caribbean is very anti-state and very much more open to individual reasoning. And reflecting that back to Caribbean people is probably the best way to kind of focus that conversation, because the latent feeling of anti-imperialism linked to capital theory, capital market oriented policies is very rich and very strong, and you learn it from school. Like in secondary school, you come up kind of are taught these things in the school. One of the biggest things now in the Caribbean is this thing called reparations policy, which is they're trying to get money from the UK because of slavery, for example. And it's actually a terrible argument. It has no basis in economics, history, or philosophy, but it's very emotional. People like it a lot. And when you see all the arguments, it's the same thing. We need to have more Marxist socialist policy in the Caribbean because that's how we have a better life. But that's why you need to have the conversation about reflecting your native art back to you, because oftentimes saying, Chicago school is the best thing isn't going to work, unfortunately speaking. So it is a tough road ahead. So that's a very good question, because it's a really core issue culturally in the Caribbean, also Latin America as well.
Well, I have a follow-up to that. I mean, are there good examples of countries in Latin America or the Caribbean that experienced an ideological shift towards more open market policies after experiencing the history of anti-capitalist or socialist policies?
Yes, but it's not a very good story in some ways either, because Panama and Chile are the core examples here, and they both had a shift by a military coup. So it's not something to easily replicate. I would say to mention Chile. So Chile is, again, the orientation shifted because the military coup happened and Pinochet did happen to put in charge the Chicago school economists. But the current president of Chile is left wing, and the government is actually skewed left. And a lot of the people who were in government under Pinochet, who really responsible for like the massive GDP per capita increase in Chile in a very short time. The graph is staggering. They thought they won. They thought, you know what, we succeeded. People have substantially better lives now. Like they used to have, for example, Milton Friedman's TV show on Chile national TV being played on the TV station with Spanish dub and Spanish subtitles. They went really hard, but then they thought we won. Why do we have to push anymore? And they stopped pushing, and the government went back left, and they're actually now dismantling a lot of the things that they built that are much more free market oriented. So even in Chile, that you saw the shift happen, where the Allende, who was socialist president, he got to vote with Pinochet, then went to more right wing, and then Pinochet allowed democracy, but the right wing things, right wing meaning open market, stuck, but then they just got unspun. And that's why, because the culture is so deeply oriented towards socialist policy, I try to make the point often, this is not a 10-year plan. This is not a 20-year plan. This is a multi-generational thing. You cannot yield towards you saying, oh, the GDP per capita is now, two magnitudes higher. No, that's not enough. You can't give up. It's a persistent recollection and persistent reinforcing of trying to actually adjust cultural practices towards more open market activity. Culture is the biggest roadblock to progress when it comes to this part of the world, because politics isn't very dynamic, as I mentioned earlier. So everything is kind of very latent. So latent things are much more difficult to change. So there are no really core good examples of this reversing from socialist policy thinking to capitalist thinking, and it became nice because it kind of always reverts back to the natural state of things being very socialist leaning. And if when you read literature in Latin America, almost every one of the writers, many Nobel Prize winners, even almost all of them are left-wing people. Almost all of them. There are two that I can think of that are not left-wing. This is Jorge Borges from Argentina, who is very libertarian, and Mario Vargas Llosa from Peru, who's also very libertarian. Him more explicitly so. But almost everything else is socialist. Even the folk music is socialist very oftentimes in Latin America. So when you realize that you're not trying to just have better economics, you're trying to have generational cultural change. That's the only way to do it for sticking purposes. You realize that, oh, this is a big battle. I like battle terms. It's not all the best thing to use, but it's a big battle. And I don't think people often take it as seriously as that, where they think about it as just, okay, you just need a bit better bureaucracy. No, your question is very salient. That's not it at all.
Well, we're about to be at time, but I would love to sneak in one more question. You obviously have a very deep wealth of knowledge about the Caribbean and Latin America, and I'm sure many other things. So, like, who are some of the thinkers that have helped you like better understand the region and development generally that you think are maybe underappreciated? Um,
Mm. First one is an economist named Dalal Warrell, who is Barbadian. He was the former governor of the Central Bank of Barbados. He is he's older guy. He's like maybe almost 80 now, I think, actually. Still alive, still working, actually. He is probably like the last example of a core Caribbean intellectual. His work, he has a book out last year, his last book was out last year, trying to synthesize the way how you really think about Caribbean or when I say Caribbean, I usually use that term for small country growth in general. How small countries are different, and he structures it in a way that makes it very sensible. And I met him the first time when I was my first year undergrad, when I just went to college before I dropped out. And he had a very big impact on how I thought about economics in general and how I thought about the Caribbean in particular. And that's probably one of the biggest impacts I've had structurally speaking with small countries. And he's now on the board of my think tank, also, actually speaking. Another important person is Michel Foucault, which is not a very common name in this kind of conversation, but Michel Foucault. So I did a lot of philosophy when I was undergrad also. And people read Michel Foucault somehow and come out left wing. I'm like, you can't possibly read Michel Foucault and come out left wing, in my opinion. Like, especially his later work. Every word in biopolitics is saying you cannot trust the government. Literally everything in that entire or over of his work. His work on prisons, institutions, almost all of it is like, no, you need to be more individual. You need to realize that power is always working against you. You need to understand where it is and how to not let it hurt your life. Yeah, a collection of his interviews called Technology of the Self. It's called Technology of the Self for a very particular reason, because the primacy of the individual is where you need to battle against power. And that had a very big impact how I think about things for sure. Jorge Borges had a very big impact on how I think about the way you structure reality. Now that's a big mythical conversation in itself, but just in the sense of oftentimes you can actually work hard to think about how the world can be better. That's what I took from that kind of his writing. There are more, but those are probably the biggest three that I can think of. Kind of core ideology building in my view.
Well, Rasheed, thank you so much. This has been a blast. We I think we all have learned a lot, and we hope to stay in touch. And thank you for all the good work you do.
Yeah, happy to chat anytime again.
Awesome. Have a good one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.